and also a facilitated conversation that we did all over Victoria with women from all industries, different occupations, regional, rural. Basically, we tried to cover as much as we could, and we asked them what their problems that they faced at work, and we also asked them what they thought solutions were. And so through that process, we spoke to over 800 women. And when we started looking at that data that came back in and analysing those conversations, women identified top 4 issues that they faced at work. One was gender pay inequality. The other was gendered violence at work or sexual harassment at work. The third one was the discrimination and intersection that women experience through caring in work, so around pregnancy discrimination, flexible work, those kind of things. And then the final one was insecure and precarious work. And out of those 4 issues, key issues, the top issue that women identified as their key challenge at work currently was gendered violence. So women didn't speak about their experiences as gendered violence. That's a term that we came up with to capture all the experiences that women were talking about, including sexual harassment. And we'll talk a bit more about that definition and how that fits together a little bit further down the track. But that's basically how we started the campaign in gendered violence, and that's where we've got a lot of our statistics and stuff from. Okay, so from that process, looking at women's experience, working women's experience, we sort of started identifying this trend, and we called it gendered violence. Gendered violence is a commonly used term in the international space. The International Labour Organization this year is going to start a conversation about gendered violence and developing a new convention around gendered violence at work. So in that international space, it's a common term, so we started to use it for our work as well. And you should be able to see on your screen from our PowerPoint, this is the current working definition we have of gendered violence. So I'll just read the first part and I'll let you read the second. But gendered violence is any behaviour or action that causes physical, sexual and or psychological harm to a worker because of their gender identity, sexual orientation, or because they do not adhere to dominant gender stereotypes or socially prescribed gender roles. And that includes sexual harassment. So we include sexual harassment in that. The reason we call it gendered violence is because while women predominantly experience these forms of violence, anyone can experience gendered violence regardless of their gender, sexuality or sex, and anyone can perpetrate gendered violence regardless of their gender, sexuality or sex. So both men and women can perpetrate gendered violence, and they can also both experience gendered violence. And also, very importantly, workers who identify as LGBTIQ+ also experience forms of gendered violence in the forms of homophobia, transphobia and things like that.
Okay, so some examples of gendered violence, and as Jodie has mentioned, we talk a lot about gendered violence, but in talking about that, we are talking about sexual harassment, but also some of the other behaviours that go with it, I suppose, or either extend that or allow the space for sexual harassment to occur. So some of those examples, as you can see, include stalking and intimidation, verbal abuse, ostracism, sexual harassment, specifically being undermined in your work or your position, some of which will seem quite generic, and could happen to anybody and do happen to other people under a form of workplace violence, however, and bullying as well. However, there are other elements to gendered violence which generally mean that the way that the violence manifests is specifically because of that definition we mentioned earlier. It's about the person that it's being directed at. So they're either a woman or LGBTIQ identified, or they are visibly someone who doesn't just conform to gender stereotypes, in which case they may be targeted for some of this type of violence.
Yes, so like Pia said, there's a whole range of behaviours and experiences that fall under gendered violence, and gendered violence can be perpetrated and experienced by anyone, however women predominantly experience it. And also, so gendered violence, we're talking about gendered violence at work, so in the workplace. So gendered violence can be perpetrated by people internal to the workplace, so that includes colleagues, managers. It can be perpetrated by people external to the workplace, so particularly in customer service or front of office industries, so like patients, students, customers, if you're a nurse or you work in retail. And it can also be perpetrated by visitors coming into a workplace. So that's people who are coming on site to do things. That could be contractors, it could be delivery personnel. But that basically gives you an idea of, so it's not just amongst workers, and it's not just, you know, customer or student to teacher or retail worker. It's a bit more complex than that. But basically, breaking down what working women told us through our raw chats process, basically they told us that gendered violence was endemic in our workplaces. So it wasn't concentrated in particular industries. It wasn't higher or lower depending on your job or your occupation. It was pretty much across all industries, across all occupations, white collar, blue collar, and women experienced it across the board regardless of their age and other compounding factors. They also told us that the gendered violence that they experienced at work was causing them serious injuries, which we'll talk about a little bit, those injuries in a little bit. But basically, you can see some stats there. I'll just read out a couple. So 64% of the women we talked to said that they had experienced some form of bullying, harassment, or violence in the workplace. And 19% had cited an unsafe workplace as a reason they'd left paid employment, they'd left that workplace. So the injuries that women sustained from workplace gendered violence were similar to the kind of injuries that you sustain from other forms of violence, but they vary slightly. But basically the experiences of gendered violence that women were reporting and the rates at which they're reporting them were pretty consistent with data internationally. So I'll just read you a couple of stats. So the International Trade Union Congress reports that worldwide 35% of women experience direct violence in the workplace, and between 40 to 50% experience unwanted sexual advances, physical contact, or other forms of sexual harassment. So it's around that 40–50%. Also, Safe Work Australia's data indicates that women suffer around 2 to 3 times more mental disorder injuries than men per million hours worked. And this claims data also shows that 1 in 3 women's mental disorder claims are attributed to some kind of harassment or bullying, compared to only 1 in 5 of men's claims. So those statistics from Safe Work Australia seem to indicate there's a gendered element to that data. And also if we look outside of the workplace, so we know this is going on in our workplaces at quite high rates, but if we look outside of our workplaces in broader society, we also see it there. So we know that 1 in 3 women has experienced physical violence, 1 in 5 women has experienced sexual violence, and 8 in 10 women between the ages of 18 and 24 were harassed on the street in the past year. And also the statistic that people will also be familiar with is that more than 1 woman per week is killed by a partner or former partner. So this stuff is happening out in society, and it's not stopping at the office door or the factory gate, it's also happening in the workplace.
So what we're talking about is a type of violence that injures workers, and the way those injuries manifest are numerous, as Jodie has alluded to. So it can be through physical injury and illness, which is quite direct, but also the other elements described in the slide, such as anxiety, post-traumatic stress disorder, being stressed, which can lead to feelings of suicide or becoming very isolated, losing confidence in the ability to deliver work, perhaps withdrawing from friends and family, etc. So it has a really, really huge impact on workers. Particularly as well, there are specific workers who are more vulnerable and are at greater risk of falling prey to some of this sort of reaction. And those are people such as refugee and migrant workers, culturally and linguistically diverse workers, and Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander workers, for example. Also those who might live with disabilities. So there'd be a whole range of people that will have compounding factors influencing their isolation and experience of that kind of violence that might be coupled with other kinds of discrimination as well. So the injuries that we're describing are the same as injuries that workers sustain from bullying and workplace violence, but the way to prevent or stop altogether gendered violence is not just by addressing the violence in the workplace, because it's not getting to the core underlying issue, which is the gendered aspect. And part of that is the fault of the society in which we all work and live, in which sexism and gender inequality and homophobia, transphobia, etc. still exist. So for that reason, it's not able to be resolved by individual workplace in and of itself, although individual workplaces obviously can make great gains in creating changes and setting standards around what's acceptable in that workplace, and that in turn has an influence on the society. So as we've talked about, gendered violence at work can cause physical and psychological injury. It's obviously then an occupational health and safety issue. And so we would talk about it in those terms, as well as a right that workers can feel safe at work and not be injured when they're at work. So we frame it in those terms. It's hard to quantify the incidence of gendered violence in Victorian workplaces outside of the data we've collected, but as Jodie said, there is data around the world and data that we've collected that seem to be giving us the same message, although there's nothing specifically coherently describing that situation in Victoria. WorkSafe's data doesn't indicate the proportion of claims that can describe gendered violence. They will be able to identify bullying claims, violence at work claims, etc., not necessarily able to break that down into a gendered component. We are actually doing work with them at the moment to help their call staff and assessors be able to talk with somebody who calls in or presents with an injury and talk through what happened and be able to identify from that it might have been gendered violence that caused the issue rather than violence at work in a more generic sense. So the Human Rights and Equal Opportunity Commission data indicates that they do deal with workplace sex discrimination complaints, although those numbers don't reflect the numbers we're talking about, because that is a more individualistic process. And so they're talking about workers there who might have made the call or taken the steps to actually make contact, whereas we're going out to workplaces and talking to people who may not, have thought to even make complaints about the issues they're experiencing. They might have normalised it. They might feel that it's not worth making an issue out of it because it risks their employment. So sometimes looking at those individual claim stats and data doesn't always help us know what's really happening. However, there is data from the Human Rights and Equal Opportunity Commission that indicates that gender discrimination is certainly widespread. And for example, 49% of mothers have reported that they experienced some sort of discrimination related to their pregnancy, maternity leave, or their return to work.
Yep, so this is why we put sexual harassment and other kinds of behaviours and discriminations in this broader category of gendered violence for the reasons that Pia spoke about. And as she said as well, it is difficult to collect data on this. Like, there's a lot of data, different data sets out there, but we're still working on really nutting out and getting some more accurate figures. We've got a few more figures around sexual harassment a bit later on, because the Australian Human Rights Commission has been doing some work on this for a while. But before we start talking more specifically and get some interaction from listeners and viewers, to talk particularly about how gendered violence and sexual harassment impacts and manifests in your industry, I just wanted to talk really briefly about some of those broader underlying drivers of gendered violence and the issues around more broadly gender inequality. So I mentioned earlier the statistic that we had from our conversations with Victorian women, which was that 19% of Victorian women cited unsafe work environment as a factor in their decision to leave paid work. So this is an issue that is very much connected to gender pay inequality. So if you've got 19% is quite a high figure of women who are leaving a workplace because they don't feel safe. And that means that they're leaving potentially well-paid and secure work and potentially going into precarious or no work at all. So in terms of a society, there's a lot of talk around at the moment around gender pay inequality, and there's a lot of, so the Me Too movement has been big, but it's broadened out into a larger conversation around gender pay inequality. And if you're an organisation or workplace that is concerned about gender pay inequality and wants to take steps to address that, then addressing sexual harassment and gendered violence in the workplace would be a big part of that, because women who feel safe in the workplace and respect in the workplace are more likely to be able to sustainably stay in those workplaces. So that's just something to think about more broadly as well.
Okay, so all workplaces, we're not across the detail of every kind of workplace. So for example, we've got offices, we've got farms, we've got radio stations, we've got hospitals. There's so many different workspaces, and we're not across the detail of how those workspaces operate. That's where you come in, because you know how your workspace operates. So we try to provide information to get you thinking about how your workplace is set up, what some of the dynamics are, what some of the physical space is, and how that might be impacting the potential for gendered violence to manifest in the workplace or sexual harassment. So when I talk about some of these examples, I'll give you broad examples, but that hopefully will get you thinking about your specific workplaces or your industry, about which, you know, I don't know a lot. So I would hope that you'd be able to start thinking about, from this conversation, start thinking about how your workplace can be set up differently if it needs to be, or how it's doing well in terms of managing some of this. So obviously power differentials within a workplace exist in most workplaces, but we know that that's where people like board members or managers can take the power to the extreme and sexually harass employees, and that can be really difficult for employees. There's often not very many avenues to deal with that issue, particularly within the organisation, that still keeps them safe and still keeps them, you know, feeling that they're able to be part of the workplace. Language can exclude people, and there's different ways language can manifest. So you can have the language as in the culture of the workplace. So the way language is used in terms of the way things are described in a workplace, in terms of your policies, or in terms of, you know, what you describe as your mission statement, etc. But it also can be in the way people speak to each other, in what people are kind of given permission to speak about, even casually in the lunchroom or on air. So depending on the angles of particular topics or particular ways of expressing things that some of your radio announcers or your programs are designed or encouraged, can also lend itself to creating an environment in which gendered violence might be more likely to manifest, and it might not. You might also find or be able to think of plenty of examples where it's not happening because of what you're doing in those situations. Also, obviously, internal and external influences can be very significant. And by that, I mean you've got the people you work with, your colleagues, but you've also got people who come in and out of that space. So potentially other people who you meet with or come in regularly to maybe deliver training to you, or who do other services.
Radio station might promote.
Yeah, promotions, whatever kinds of things that happen in your workplace, as well as external. So we often mean customers or patients, but in your case it's probably your listener base, and perhaps if you have talkback, it's people who call in. So there's people there that might be, you know, manifesting some of those behaviours, and then it's about how you deal with them. So if you had, say, a female radio presenter who then, you know, has a listener base that has certain expectations about how she should behave or talk, then that might have an impact on her ultimately. So there's things like that to consider, as well as physical space, which is just generically around safety, like that people can get to and from work, are safe within the workspace, etc. And also just other things. So the additional that I've put up there is really just because you'll have specific examples that we'd be really interested to hear about, because we actually don't know much about your industry, but you'll have specific examples in mind about things that have happened in your workplaces, or I'm sure this conversation is getting you thinking about specific gaps or areas where you might think, oh yeah, there's capacity there for something to happen. You know, so it'd be really interesting to hear from you what those are, so we could put our minds to making suggestions around what could be done to address some of those areas. Okay, so gendered violence in the workplace. This is actually, you'll see some really choice quotes up there in the talking boxes. Those are from an email that was sent to one of our female workers last year. So that was sent by a manager or a site manager from a large developer called Element 5 and VCon. So someone who works in the city, works around the city doing, you know, huge, big building jobs and runs the whole show. There were some safety concerns around their sites and the way they ran their sites. So the OHS team the OHS team in our workplace had been coordinating some protests around some of the safety issues, which were significant safety issues. And this email came in. So that's the kind of stuff that we know women can experience directly. Also, we know that on social media and I think radio and TV, etc., sometimes people seem to have less of a filter on and feel that they're able to say things more explicitly, like they have in this example. And so we know that women, we see it all the time on social media, on general media, the way women are vilified in those public forums. So this just gives you an example of the way it can manifest.
So I noticed there's some questions coming up, so I'm just going to have a conversation. So I'm not sure how this works, but I'm thinking what we can continue this conversation and cover this and sexual harassment, and then maybe go to some questions so that we've got plenty of time for questions. Then at the end we can wrap up with some actions that people can take and stuff. Just because I'm noticing there's a flashing speech bubble and stuff going on, so I'm conscious that people are asking questions, which is great. Yes, questions are at the end. I can see it from Danny. Great. Okay. I was getting confused. Gender. So like Pia said, we want you to start thinking about how this manifests in your workplace so that we can have some really good conversations that will be useful for you. But basically, it manifests differently, like Pia said. But some questions that will be useful to start thinking about, if you're not already, is how does your workplace currently respond to gendered violence and sexual harassment? And what measures does your workplace currently have in place to prevent gendered violence and sexual harassment? Back to you.
Thank you. Okay, so we've talked a lot about gendered violence and sexual harassment and the other ways that violence manifests. So we just wanted to drill down to what sexual harassment is specifically. So it's defined as an unwelcome sexual advance. It's an unwelcome request for sexual favours or other unwelcome conduct of a sexual nature, and it makes a person feel offended, humiliated or intimidated, and a reasonable person would be able to anticipate that reaction in the circumstances. So hopefully that makes sense to you. It's pretty clear. Some of the examples of sexual harassment can include unwelcome touching, staring or leering, sexually explicit pictures or posters being sent to someone or being visible, like at a workstation or in a work site, unwanted and repeated invitations to go on dates or to, either hang out or have a drink or what have you, requests for sex, intrusive questions about a person's private life or their body, unnecessary familiarity, deliberately brushing up against a person, sending sexually explicit emails or SMS messages, etc. So that kind of focus, where it's sexual in focus and it's definitely not wanted, but it continues. And as it said in the definition, any reasonable person would be able to predict that that was going to be the case. So the working environment or workplace culture that is sort of has a high sort of sexualized focus or quite hostile is also likely to have higher levels of unlawful sexual harassment. Some of those factors which might contribute to that could include displays of obscene or pornographic materials, general sexual banter, crude conversations, innuendo and offensive jokes. So this is where you've got a workplace culture where there's a pretty low bar around boundaries and respect for other people. So, you know, things coming to conversation over lunch, just in the corridor as people chit chat. So that it just decreases the standard really around that workplace, which then can give rise to some of that sexual harassment being considered maybe just an extension of the culture, an extension of the joke, an extension of the general behaviour. So the Sex Discrimination Act, this is a Commonwealth Act, makes sexual harassment unlawful in many areas of public life, and it includes employment situations and also places where we have, sorry, I got distracted by the buzzing on the computer. Employment situations, educational institutions where there's provision of goods and services, accommodation services, and in the administration of Commonwealth laws or programs. The person who's responsible for sexual harassment primarily is the person who does the sexual harassment. However, employers and others can be held responsible if their workplace is, as we talked about earlier, got a low standard around some of that boundary setting, around expectations and around behaviour in a workplace. So first and foremost, the person who does the behaviour is responsible and accountable for that behaviour. They make the choice to do it, and there's no excuse and there's no scenario in which that's viable or acceptable, and that includes being stressed or using alcohol and other drugs, or you know, having some other drama in their life. There's no time in which sexual harassment is acceptable. But there are times as well where where the employer or the environment that that person is operating within are held to account as well, because they're not also setting a standard. Because often with some of this behaviour, we know that there's been a build up. Like, people don't often do this out of the blue. People would have generally known that this person was like this. This person might have done other things previously, or just talked or behaved in ways that were already indicating that they had pretty low boundaries around some of these respectful behaviours, and nothing was done. Like, no policies were enacted in the workplace, or no measures were taken to intervene and protect other people in the workplace, and also to give an opportunity for that person to learn and understand that their behaviour was unacceptable. So in that sense, that is when employers can become responsible, and they may become liable, which can also mean that they end up being held to account themselves, and may need to have to put interventions in place or take responsibility for improving that workplace after an incident. And this can include going through WorkSafe, or being required to provide training or improve policies that are well implemented, improved communication and reinforcement of those policies.
Could I jump in as well?
Sure.
Like you said, so I think the definition of Sexual Discrimination Act is really clear when you think about it, if you break it down, because often a question that's often asked in these conversations, like, oh, but how do I know what's too much? Like, because it might be different for everyone. So, you know, before I used, you know, there's one woman in my workplace and she doesn't mind if I come and comment on what she looks like. But now I can't do that, so I don't know what to do. How do I know? Like, it's hard to know. And I think it's really useful when you look at that definition. There's 3 elements to it that are key, and it's that it is behaviour of a sexual nature that is unwelcome. So it's of a sexual nature, it's unwelcome, and any reasonable person would think that it was unwelcome. So then people say, well, what's a reasonable person? Well, you know, the best way to ask is, you know, ask before you do something. If you would normally hug people at workplace, don't just hug them, ask, because a reasonable person might not want to hug. So I think that's really key. And like Pia said as well, really importantly, in the Sexual Discrimination Act, it's a duty on, like Pia pointed out, sexual harassment can take place in any public space. So the Act covers any public space. However, a statistic that's really interesting is according to the Human Rights Commission, the Australian Human Rights Commission, is 68% of sexual harassment takes place at work. So while sexual harassment can take place in any public space, 68% happens at work, and employers have a duty, a positive duty under that Act, to prevent and minimise sexual harassment. So like Pia said, if you're sexually harassed at work, your employer is going to be liable if they haven't taken steps to prevent it. And under OH&S legislation as well, employers also have a positive duty to make sure you're safe at work, which we'll talk about a little bit later on. So, employer obligations. Before I go into that, I just thought it was really interesting to talk a little bit, because we mentioned before how it's really hard to get statistics, but every year the Australian Bureau of Statistics does a personal safety survey, and in 2016, which was the last time one was done, they found that 1 in 2 women and 1 in 4 men had experienced sexual harassment during their lifetime. But interestingly, in the last 12 months, 1 in 6 women and only 1 in 11 men had experienced sexual harassment. And also, this comes back to the data point, is according to the Human Rights Commission, only 1 in 5 victims make a formal complaint. So that's really key to, like Pia said, why we don't really know the extent of this stuff. So basically, like I've alluded to, so in order to stop gendered violence and work out who's responsible and how we can start making inroads, so gendered violence is, and sexual harassment is an industrial issue, and it's a serious OH&S hazard that employers and regulators, so regulators include things like WorkSafe Body, WorkSafe or WorkSafe Australia, and the Human Rights Commission. So it's a serious hazard that they need to recognise. And also employers and regulators must take steps to prevent gendered violence from injuring workers and develop the capacity to adequately respond to incidents of gendered violence. So they have an obligation under both OH&S legislation and also under the Sex Discrimination Act to take steps to prevent the risk of sexual harassment and gendered violence at work, and also they have responsibility in how they respond to that as well.
Okay, so some solutions, and these are definitely not all the solutions, some solutions that we suggest. Obviously, we are going to say you need to work with unions because that's where we're coming from. But in reality, unions have done a lot of work in understanding the industrial context and the occupational health and safety context around gendered and family violence, so as workplace issues specifically. So in that sense, we do believe that we are doing some very, very important work in trying to improve workplaces across Victoria and Australia in this particular domain. So our process is always to consult with workers on any work that we're trying to implement. So two of our major achievements in recent years have been the Family Violence Clause and the Stop Gendered Violence at Work Model Clause. So I'm not as familiar with radio stations and whether you have enterprise agreements or whether you just have policies within your workplaces. If you don't have enterprise agreements, then these clauses that I'm talking about would basically be presented as policy. If you have enterprise agreements, then we'd be encouraging that you have these clauses in the enterprise agreement and then supported by a policy. So the Stop Gendered Violence at Work Model Clause and Family Violence Clause both frame it as both frame the issue of gendered violence as one that workplaces are responsible for, because we know that both of those come to work, like they affect people in the workplace, and they don't just affect the people who are being directly involved. So not just the person choosing to use the behaviour, and not just the person who have, sorry, I'm reading the speech bubbles as they come up. It's very distracting. So I'm getting feedback there about your situation. I saw someone said you're volunteers and you have policies. So that's good to know. Policies also can be just as effective, and particularly in volunteer workplaces, that's also great, and they can be effective in that context. So we would say that those clauses are still necessary, and we're able to, those won't be available on our website, but we can send them to Danny, and Danny can get you to have a look at them. And yes, Tony, agreeing with that about policies are only as good as those enforcing. That's why from the union perspective, we also think that they need to be in awards and enterprise agreements, because then they become legislated and they're more effective, because a policy can be ignored or overlooked or changed quite easily. However, if it's all that you've got, then it's also the best way to go forward, is at least you've got something cohesive to tie the organisation together. So in the family violence clause, we've had around since 2010. It's now in, Jodie, how many workplaces in Australia? Yeah.
You're like 100
Sorry, we had these stats the other day for something else. Anyway, it's hundreds now. It's in the realm of hundreds. The Stop Gendered Violence at Work model clause is very new. We just finalised it last year, but now we are working very, very strongly and closely with WorkSafe and the union movement and workplaces to try and get it to have traction in those environments as well. So we believe they're two very effective ways to keep workplaces safe and improving, because in those clauses we talk about the need for training and being updated with relevant information, reporting mechanisms.
Confidential reporting mechanisms are really key. Can I just pick up on what Tony said about policies only being as good as how they're implemented? That is always true, and that's why we've spoken a little bit today. A lot of our work is about going out and talking to workers, because it's only workers and volunteers and people who are in these workplaces that are going to be able to make these policies effective. So it's collectively we need to come together to push to make sure that these things are happening. But that's where also the Equal Opportunity Act, or the Sex Discrimination Act, and the OHS legislation can be useful as well, because those are there for us to use. So if your policy, your workplace could have policies and they might ignore them, as a lot of workplaces do, but you can still go through, you can report to the Human Rights Commission or WorkSafe to escalate that and get action. And there's other stuff in the health safety, the health place, it's called something different, it's the Workplace Health and Safety Act, that you can use to take collective action, like putting provisional infringement notices on employers if they're not enacting their policies or keeping you safe. Sorry, that was just a brain thought with the bubble.
Yeah, sure, thank you. Okay, so questions, we're happy to take questions, but before we do, we also just want to make it really clear that we're always available to talk to any of you individually, whatever state you're in, that's fine. If you ever want to call or email us, I don't have the details on the slide, but you will find the details on our website, and you're always welcome to give us a call or email if you have a specific scenario or question. We're more than happy to talk that through with people, because it's a very new area of work and there's not many people who are necessarily, not necessarily that many places you can go to get the information. So yeah, don't hesitate to contact us. So if there's any questions, now we're happy to answer them, of course.
How do we do that?
Yes, we're not.
What I'll do is I'll ask you guys the questions just so people can hear them. I've just muted you guys quickly, because what will happen is I will be feeding back through your microphone. So I'll turn your mic back on as soon as I've asked the question. First question is, what recourse does a woman have when her station's general manager, and I guess this would apply to board and other people's in position, has sexually harassed her and the board is made aware of said harassment, but the board chooses not to act? Is there anywhere else that a person can go to in regards to that? And I guess that's sort of the thing that we were discussing in the lead up to this webinar, is if it's the person in the position of power who's the one who's perpetrating the act, where can the victim go to? And your mic's on now.
I can start that and then Pia can jump in if I forget stuff. That's a really, really common issue, like Pia mentioned, in all workplaces. So power is a big key in gendered violence. It's an underlying factor, and so it's a question we get all the time. You've got a number of options. One of them is your union. So the Media, Art and Entertainment Alliance is a good place to go. They can help you and give you advice. Other options are you can call up the Australian Human Rights Commission and report sexual harassment and talk to them, and they've got options through their process that you have for recourse. And you can also You can also contact other services like women's legal services. The thing to keep in mind, and again, because of the power, you have to decide what's best for you, because and make these decisions with a lot of thought, because as we know and women report is that often they're the ones that when they report and they take it further, they are often the ones that are penalised. So they often can become it becomes untenable for them to stay in their workplace. That's really common, and this is partly why we've moved in Victoria the issue of sexual harassment into an occupational health and safety frame, because in the past it's been focused on individuals, like the example that was given, having to make a complaint and then that not being dealt with and having to escalate that. What that happens is often the victim who's experiencing sexual harassment is being victimised, and often they're seen as the liability and the risk in the workplace, and they're kind of pushed out of the workplace and the perpetrator remains. So having an OH&S framework and a union framework allows the union and occupational safety, health and safety legislation to take a collective response to say this workplace isn't safe. And it's not just not safe for one person, it's not safe for everyone, because everyone's witnessing this. So I guess the thing to keep in mind, depending on which avenue you go through, is to really think about the implications of that, because from our perspective, there's no one avenue that's perfect that will necessarily at this point.
But the other thing that we talk about in the both our clauses is the necessity or the preference to have contact people appointed who have been trained in knowing how to deal with that specific issue. So if we talk about it in the union framework, we have delegates and we have health and safety reps, but we also, you don't have to have that model. You can also just have someone appointed separately as a family violence or gender violence contact person, and that person would be someone who's set up within the organisation to support that person. So in a case where you've got a woman where something's happened, you would have ideally someone there she can go to, that she can talk to confidentially, who also understands the process to go through, can talk her through those options and support her. But also, if that was the case, you'd be more likely to have a workplace that had more positive attitude about dealing with this issue, because they would have taken those steps to put the policy in place, to put the clause in place, to appoint people to those roles. And I'm also aware, as I'm saying it, that if you're volunteers, you've already got limited time in what you can do. But it is something that still can be considered by boards and workplaces. It's such.
Yeah, and we can pass on the details of the Human Rights Commission and other places that you can call to report to seek more advice in your jurisdiction. We know the referrals of Victoria, but we're not as aware of them. But we can pass on that information.
Excellent. All right, thank you very much for that. Next question is, when investigating a complaint, is it correct practice to inform both accuser and accused of all the steps taken in the investigation and outcomes?
Well, so it will depend on the circumstances. But so if we're talking about sexual harassment, the primary issue is that the person who's experienced it must be kept safe. So there might be times where you need to remove, you should never be removing or penalising the victim of that experience. It should be the perpetrator of it who has to take the penalty, I suppose. So there would be times potentially where somebody needs to be moved or told that they're not able to come into a space. So I'll give you an example, say a school where there's a heterosexual couple working there and the woman discloses that she's experienced family violence from him, and she has an intervention order, then he will be expected to not be in her spaces rather than her not being expected to be moved out. So it's the same in that sense, that you would be having to make sure that in a case of sexual harassment that the perpetrator was aware where they're able to go or not go in terms of being near that person, but not, they shouldn't be knowing the details. They shouldn't be knowing sort of any sort of gossip or or even like just sort of the speculation about it. It's more just the facts of it, like this has happened, we're dealing with it, and for that, in that time you're not able to be in the same room as that person or whatever, but it's not about, you wouldn't be giving them details or yeah, sort of all the sort of extra bits and pieces that would go with that, or any confidential information about the victim, or any details even about what had happened that could put that person at risk.
Yeah, I think that's right. What we would say as well is that you would treat the investigation in the way you would investigate any other health and safety issue. So for bullying, you would follow the same kind of procedure, except with this case, like Pia's saying, you would add in extra safety steps. So you have to ensure that the person is safe, but you would hope that in a bullying case, you did the same thing, that the victim was safe. So the OHS is very clear about how you pursue those investigations. But the other thing to mention here as well, and this is a difficult space, is that we said before only 1 in 5 people report sexual harassment, and there's a reason for that, because often the investigation process is really problematic, where people aren't believed and the burden of proof is really high. And it's like bullying, it's really hard to prove you've got bullying, because like we said, most sexual harassment, I don't know if I said the statistic, but most sexual harassment, according to the Human Rights Commission, is non-physical. So it's psychological and verbal. So, you know, that compounds this issue of people not reporting. And so the investigative processes can compound that. So I guess what we say, like here, we say with gendered violence and family violence, there's do's and don'ts when someone reports that. One is that you believe them and that you don't question their integrity. Now, you have to, as a workplace, that has to be investigated in certain ways, but we talk about responsible representation. So your organisation might have policies, but there are OHS policies, and unions have policies around this as well. So the job of the investigator is to ensure fair process for the perpetrator, but is not to automatically disbelieve the victim or collude to pass on any information that's not absolutely necessary for the person being investigated to know, and to not condone that, you know, not just to automatically disbelieve the claim and to sort of collude and make, because that's a big part of why this happens, because when you've got a workplace where these kind of claims are dismissed through an investigation process offhand, and quite rarely it colludes with violence, so it creates a workplace culture where this is seen as something you can get away with. So it's difficult, and I should mention as well before I let Danny mute us again, but we're also in the process of writing a workplace guide for sexual harassment and gendered violence, which will talk about all these things, how to do this in best practice, and we're in the process of writing that at the moment.
Well, I'd like to say that we would be very keen to have a look at that work when it's completed. And I have muted you again. Obviously, this is just a technical thing and not some sort of mansplaining thing. The next question that we have, what if the incident happens at work or at a work function or sort of any other work event outside of the workplace, and you're back on now?
So if it's happened outside, if it's anything to do with work, it's still considered a workplace issue. So it could be at a Christmas party, could be at a staff retreat, it could be at a event where family have been invited to come along for kids' Christmas, whatever, picnic. So anything that you're present at because of your work, it's considered the workplace.
Yeah. Traveling in company cars, anything like that.
Yeah, or traveling for work, anything.
Okay, then excellent. Thanks so much for that. Here's a bit of a curly one. This person talks about an incident where a volunteer who was working on reception was repeatedly approached for dates by someone who was accessing the building because they share their premises with other businesses. She became uncomfortable and reported the incident. It ceased. They're concerned that it happened again. The board felt fairly powerless to act as the individual was not affiliated sort of with their organisation. Do you have any suggestions for managing this or preventing a repeat situation?
Yep, the board shouldn't have been worried at all because it's completely within the jurisdiction, so they don't have to feel unsure about taking action because that person was coming into the workplace and that workplace was where that volunteer was, so they would execute their duty of care in the same way they would if it was in the back room in the office, and they would take steps to stop that happening and keep that worker safe.
And they are actually still obliged to, because that person is there, that person at the front desk was there because of her role in, or I think you said her role in the workplace, then they're there because of work, and so actually the employer does have an obligation in that circumstance to be proactive or more active about finding ways to keep her safe.
Excellent. I've just muted you guys again quickly, so I have a quick chat. It's a question that's sort of been directed to me and the CBAA. Where a station is unable to implement effective policies or processes to deal with sexual harassment issues, does the CBAA offer support to assist either the station in meeting its obligations and or support to victims? We are kind of hoping that this webinar and a few other resources that we're putting up online and other stuff will be directing to, that is at the unionwomen.org.au website. I'm going to put up some links to all of this stuff in a second because there's just so many great resources there. Hopefully this is the first step to us being more on the front foot with being able to react to all of these things. As such, we're very lucky to have our presenters here this evening getting the ball rolling on this one, but we would hope that sort of the sector as a whole is going to respond and react to the overarching environment at the moment, in which that we're drawing a line in the sand and saying that this sexual harassment in any way, shape or form is no longer acceptable. But yeah, more than happy to continue that conversation with you and also to continue to send on all of the resources from this evening. I don't think there are any more questions unless I've missed any. If I have missed any, now is the time to speak now or forever hold your peace. We will, of course, keep the channels of communication open with Pia and Jody because we'd be silly not to. I will turn your microphone back on. You're on.
Okay, great. So the other thing that I think is really important to remember, so first of all, I want to emphasise people can call us or email us, and don't hesitate to do so because we're happy to talk through any situations. But I think the best way to deal with this issue is to be proactive and prevent, and that's by having the strong and effective policies and practices for workplaces, and that does include volunteer organisations. So you're more likely, if you've got a proactive workplace that's really not shying away from dealing with this issue or talking about this issue, it just makes it harder for it to manifest, but it also means that people are clearer about their right to not experience that in that workplace. So best case scenario is that you have very proactive and very active live policies and people within who are very well aware of their right to talk about that, the issues and be safe in their workplaces.
Yep, I would echo that and also say we spoke about a little bit, but we have toned it down today, so we've gone quite well. This is a collective issue, so for us, the best strength is in numbers, and the best strength is us all coming together to stop this happening and start addressing it. So it's really important. I mean, obviously, you've got a workplace with a lot of volunteers, but Mia is doing great work in this space, coming together collectively to address this issue. And also, the important thing with sexual harassment and gendered violence, it might seem like an individual issue that one person has experienced it and they're kind of unlucky. But it's actually not, because gendered violence and sexual harassment impacts everyone around it, because it creates a culture where it's more likely to happen to more people. And also, gendered violence, just because you're not the direct recipient of the violence, doesn't mean that it doesn't have an impact and injure you. So this is a problem that we all share, and what we talk about in the union room, it's about coming together and finding collective solutions and making sure those policies are actually being implemented, and we're actually saying, no, this is not good enough and we don't feel safe, and everyone has the right to feel safe and respected at work, and we're going to come together and make sure that happens regardless if you're a man, woman, gay, transgender, it doesn't matter. Everyone has the right to be safe at work and not experience sexual harassment.
Awesome. Thank you so much for that. This has been absolutely fantastic. I'm just going to take control of the screen for a second. I hope you don't mind, because I just wanted to show a couple of the things that you've got on your website. I'll just put this in the instant message box because it's really great, and I would encourage people to have a look at it. All of the resources available in regards to this is including a Stop Gendered Violence at Work campaign kit. I'll just put the link for that in the instant message box now. And also, is it my screen that's showing at the moment? Oh, geez, I hope it's my screen that's showing right now. It is. But so much great content available from the Union Women website, as linked to from the Victorian Trades Hall Council. I will be letting everyone who has attended our webinar know all about that in the follow-up emails that we're sending through to everyone. I'll also turn your, I'll stop the webcam sharing now, guys, just in case you wanted to pick your nose or something like that. I'm assuming you're not necessarily going to do that, but I thought I'd just let you know. On behalf of the Community Media Training Organisation and the Community Broadcasting Association of Australia, thank you so much to Pia and Jody from the Victorian Trades Hall Council. This has been one of the best webinars we've ever run. We're going to be, of course, staying in touch with everyone about this. Any of the resources that they're going to make available, we will in turn be making those available to all of our wonderful community broadcasters. I do note that there was a question there from Tony Sanders about not-for-profit organisations allowed to use their bylaws to restrict volunteers from speaking out about sexual harassment occurring within the station. Indeed, they are not allowed to do that. I would suggest that the opposite is true. The policies and procedures are there in place to protect volunteers and to allow them to help speaking out about this. But obviously, it is a big issue and one that we all need to work on. So I guess we just need to stay on the front foot with this, stay vigilant and do everything we can to ensure that this is something that is being reported on and that there is action taking place there at community broadcasting stations. Pia and Jody, I'll just turn your microphone back on just in case you've got any final thoughts. Thank you so much for everything this evening. This has been absolutely fantastic.
Thank you very much for having us.
Yes, thanks a lot. And I'm happy to continue the conversation. It's a real privilege.
Yeah, well, it's a privilege to have you guys involved. This is absolutely wonderful to have people of your stature and knowledge in this field here to present this to our community broadcasters. It's really wonderful. What I put it to you now that hopefully this might be something that we'll be able to revisit on a regular basis, and hopefully when we do revisit it on a regular basis, if that's allowable, we are seen as having made progress with all of this. So thank you very much once again.
Thank you.
You guys are absolutely amazing. I will be in touch with you early next week to say thank you to you once again. But I'll let you go now. Thanks for taking time out of your busy schedules to join us here for this evening's webinar.
No problem.
Wow, that was absolutely fantastic. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us as well. Don't forget our next webinar, 30th of May, Advanced Mixing Techniques Using EQ and Compression. Kelly's going to be presenting that one. Then 10 Good Governance Tips for Community Radio Boards will be happening after that one. I look forward to seeing you here again. Thank you so much for joining us here this evening. This is Danny Chifley on behalf of the Community Broadcasting Association. Thanks so much to Pia and Jody, and thank you so much for joining us. We'll see you next time.